Hello friends, it's Kat from Meow Meow Kapow. Like many YouTube art channels, I've amassed a kind of ridiculous hoard of things I meant to review but never got around to. In one of my other paint tests, a lot of you mentioned the DaVinci brand, and wouldn't you know it, I just so happen to already have this 6-color mixing set buried under a pile of other random art nonsense. Art nonsense, of course, being a technical term trademarked by the Art Science Authority. Use it wisely. Anyway, per standard operating procedure, I made a quick mini palette to test their drying and rewetting capabilities, which are pretty important to me. They did wonderfully in both regards, with almost no shrinkage in the pans after dried, definitely no cracking, and they all reactivated beautifully. It did take over a solid week for them to fully dry out, but this isn't uncommon. If you're familiar with my channel, most of the mini palettes I make include only 5 colors and easily wedge themselves inside an Altoid Smalls container. The DaVinci mixing set is 6 colors though, as it is a split primary set, meaning there is one each of a cool-toned red, yellow, and blue, and one each of a warm-toned red, yellow, and blue. This meant I needed something with a bit more space. The tin I'm using for this palette is a green tea mint tin from Trader Joe's, and while some may be put off initially by the clear window for its lid, that's actually an advantage to the set. It harkens a lot back to the Sennelier Aqua Mini set with a clear lid that I think is actually really misunderstood. More on that later. The colors included are Red Rose Deep, Vermilion Hue, Airlight Yellow, Hansa Yellow Light, Ultramarine Blue, and Phthalo Blue. Unsurprisingly, because a good split primary set can make just about any color you can dream of with a bit of work, the color chart on this one is gorgeous. I will say that I think the 2 yellows were too similar to really be of much note, and I would have preferred if they'd pushed them further apart, like how the 2 reds are very different in this set. As for the glorious, gorgeous layering test, it's basically impossible to see both in person and in the footage how those yellows held up, but the Airlight layers slightly better than the Hansa Yellow Light. All the other colors, you can clearly see the way they build beautifully and have a wonderful vibrancy and clarity of color to them, even after being dried. The only color, aside from the hard to really see what's happening anyway yellows that only did okay rather than stellar in the layering test, was the Vermilion Hue. It's certainly built in intensity as you look down the line, it just seems slightly to have done it a bit less gracefully than the other colors. As far as lifting and opacity goes, pretty much all of these colors are semi-staining at best and straight-up staining at worst. The Vermilion Hue, Hansa Yellow Light, and Ultramarine Blue do have the lightest hint of opacity to them, but it's largely so unnoticeable that I did have to squint a bit at the swatches in person before making this statement just to be sure. For wet-on-wet applications, I actually find the bloom pattern of these paints to be pretty interesting. Most watercolors I do this test to seem to either have high flow in some colors and low flow in others, or high and low exclusively over the range. DaVinci, over these specific 6 colors I have to test, are pretty much all what I would think of as identically medium flow. They feather just enough that you can blend easily if you want to avoid harsh lines, but don't go so crazy as to cause you to lose control. As a person who appreciates middle ground such as these, and predictable consistency, this is very intriguing. Per usual, as a practical test, I made a doodle finder with these paints. If you're not familiar with this technique, I've linked a video in the iCards, but essentially I make a giant scribble across the page and try to find an image inside it. That's why these pictures often have random proportions and subjects, because they are actually completely randomized. Let's talk about that clear window in the lid. In the Sennelier palette that I mentioned earlier, which has the same feature, I use it to accurately see exactly what any given mix of colors will look like on whatever surface I'm about to paint on. This is especially useful when you're using paper that isn't brilliant white, or when, like me, despite often using white ceramic palettes, you're still kind of terrible at judging what intensity of color you've mixed up. Plus, if you're going to glaze one color on top of another, it'll help you to know how that will change the piece, since glazing colors on top of one another often looks different than mixing them together initially might. Clear lids are totally awesome because using that window shows you really what that color you've mixed up will look like on the page, and I totally support them. While I got the particular mint tin I'm using at a grocery store, I will link that Sennelier palette as well as all the other materials used in this video down in the doobly-doo. One of the things about this paint brand in particular that really delighted me was that there is a great clarity of color and inner brilliance to them, even in some of the deeper, darker, shadowy areas. The luminosity of Sennelier paints is what eventually won me over about them, and I'm finding that there are a lot of similarities to how both Sennelier and DaVinci feel in use. These layer super nicely, and because they do re-wet well despite some colors leaving noticeable staining, even when I was lazy about my edges, I was usually able to wet them after they dried and soften them out enough to make them look natural. It was also really great being able to feel like I could build and build and build in this painting without it beginning to look dull and lifeless. By the end of it, I'd pushed some areas super dark so as to nearly be black, and they still had an appealing warmth to them that helped to really bring shape to this wacky character. In my head, because I was loving the layerability and vibrancy of these paints, I kept comparing them to my Sennelier, which I'm sure y'all are tired of hearing me mention in this video by now. But here's the thing. Sennelier, like M. Graham, is well known for being honey-based in their formula. Both brands usually take over a week to fully dry out in their pans from being freshly poured, just like these DaVinci did. Both brands can also build to a really intense but still lively and vibrant color density, just like these DaVinci. And even though I personally find it a struggle to make subtle and transparent layers with M. Graham because their pigment load is seriously totally crazy high, M. Graham and Sennelier are both pretty darn good, if not completely amazing when it comes to layering. Especially Sennelier. Seriously, their layering is awesome. So I just assumed DaVinci was a honey-based brand as well. Except then I remembered that silly saying about assuming and decided to actually Google it, and after a bit of searching I have come to the conclusion that DaVinci aren't honey-based? I know I'm saying that like it's a question, and that's because I'm actually not sure. They don't say they aren't honey paints, but aside from mentioning the pigment are dispersed in the finest quality natural gum, the ingredients that aren't included aren't listed. Which is pretty common when you think about it. If you buy a bag of gummy worms, you don't expect there to be a list of all the things that aren't in it, you expect it to say what is in it. The only hint I got as to whether or not there is honey in these is a blog post from doodlewash.com that offhandedly mentions they use a special rewetting agent that works as well as honey, if not better, which implies there isn't honey, after all. Does this mean that these paints are vegan? There were a couple of mentions while I was searching about how DaVinci doesn't use another common animal ingredient in their paints known as oxgall, which usually increases the blooming and flowing, which, as we mentioned before, is pretty neutral in strength of these paints. I'm going to be honest and say that at this point, I have absolutely no idea if the entire DaVinci line is vegan. I certainly know that, at the very least, the color selection that the ridiculously amazing Denise Soden curated is fully vegan. But the time between me deciding to write this script and recording the voiceover for upload is too narrow to conduct a full interrogation of the brand representatives. Plus, the focus of these tests is usually more on the performance of the paints themselves, which, by the way, was great. This was another brand where the paint itself was such a pleasure to use that I never once felt like we were fighting against one another, which I think you can see in the final painting. I always feel like the more fun a paint is to work with, the more depth ends up getting put into the test paintings. Personally, this is a brand I'd love to experiment with more in the future. Come to think of it, I may actually have 2 or 3 other tubes of DaVinci somewhere that I poured and left to dry but never put into a palette. Let me know what you think. A lot of you either requested DaVinci be tested out or were big supporters of the brand already. And if you know definitively about the overall veganness or not of the line, feel free to pipe up about it. Until I see you next time, I wish you peace, love, and enormous brilliant eyeballs. Bye!